Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Alyssa DeFilippo of Parents Helping Parents, the program manager for Connections California, our online statewide resource and information hub for transition to adulthood and adult services. You are at What I've Learned from Working with Adults on the Spectrum. Michael Pinkerton is our presenter for the evening, and he has been a part of integrated community services in Marin County for over 10 years. He is currently the Director of Living Skills Services. He has much experience supporting individuals as they make their way in the world. And Michael finds it very satisfying to help people undertake these transitions and see how much they grow from their endeavors. Michael is also a marriage family therapist working with individuals, couples, and families. His practice has a strong focus on work with individuals on the autism spectrum and their families. Just a reminder that slides will be sent out tomorrow to attendees, along with any links or resources that we've discussed, and the recording of this presentation will be available in PHP's video library within 3 or 4 weeks. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Michael. Thank you, Beatrice, our interpreter. And I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to Michael.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for having me, and thanks to Parents Helping Parents. All right, well, I will share screen and we will get started. So this presentation is what I've learned from working with adults on the spectrum. So first, I just want to talk about what we're going to cover during this presentation. I will briefly speak about my background, and then I will talk about common features, so diagnostic features of autism spectrum disorder. I will then discuss individual differences among people on the spectrum, and then I will provide examples of experiences of individuals on the spectrum that illustrate some of these difficulties and differences. Lastly, I will talk about some strategies to build skills and improve relationships. So, as I said before, I'm Michael Pinkerton. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I've been working as a therapist with individuals and families since 2018. About half or more of the people I work with at any given time are on the spectrum. I am also a director of living skills programs at Integrated Community Services, an agency in San Rafael, California, serving people with developmental disabilities. I have worked there since 2013, and I have worked in this field of disability services since 2008. Okay, so we start off with commonalities, and these commonalities are the basis on which a diagnosis of autism is made. If these attributes are present, a person can get an autism diagnosis. And these are difficulty with social interactions, difficulty in nonverbal communication, things like interpreting facial expressions and expressing oneself nonverbally, difficulty in using language appropriately in social situations, an enjoyment or need for repetition, and difficulties being mentally flexible. People with ASD may also appear disinterested in social interactions. They may have emotional or sensory dysregulation, and they may have difficulty understanding humor, sarcasm, or figurative language. Now, autism is currently diagnosed by level. A level 1 diagnosis means that the person requires some support in the areas that I just mentioned. Now, most of the people who have ASD and come to me for therapy are in this category. The old diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome falls into this group. Now, a person getting a level 2 diagnosis means that the person requires substantial support, often like living skills services, say from a regional center. Now, most of the people who we support at Integrated Community Services fall into this category. And then we have people with a level 3 diagnosis, which means that the person requires very substantial support. And I have worked with a few individuals in this category. Now, I have observed, especially as someone grows up and gets more experience, that they might originally have had a level 2 or a level 3 diagnosis, but may require less support and developed increased abilities in these areas over time. Now, the focus really of today's presentation is those areas that specifically impact relationships and what this looks like. Because really, social relationships are the focus in my work with individuals on the spectrum. And these are the areas, and then we'll look at some examples. So in the area of social understanding and communication, people on the spectrum typically struggle with reciprocal social interaction, and that is having a back and forth conversation. Fitting into a group conversation can also be very difficult. Reading social cues, gestures, facial expressions, and knowing what's been called the unwritten rules of social relationships is typically very difficult for someone on the spectrum. Also, expressing oneself so that others understand tends to also be hard. Now, people on the spectrum also tend to have restricted, repetitive, and sometimes rigid patterns in behaviors, interests, and activities. There is often a strong focus on particular interests like planes, trains, video games. But I have also seen many individuals who focus on things like relationships or fairness. But naturally, kind of this restricted focus can get in the way of developing relationships. Another difficult area is executive functioning. And executive functioning has many parts, but specifically, we're going to talk about two that really affect relationships a lot. And one is a difficulty in abstract thinking. So often, people on the spectrum are concrete and literal thinkers, and they may engage in a lot of black and white or all or none thinking. Hard to see shades of gray. Now, also, the difficulty in abstract thinking relates to struggles with theory of mind. And theory of mind is the ability to think about what others are thinking or feeling. And difficulties here affect one's ability to recognize the impact of their actions on others. And it also makes it hard to determine what others are likely to be thinking or feeling. So this can impact relationships a lot. And the last area that I want to address, though a little more briefly than the other areas, is sensory issues. People on the spectrum often have a great sensitivity to food, textures, and smells. And I also have seen and heard of lots of instances where food sensitivities to gluten and sometimes to food additives results in irritability and bad temper and other symptoms that can really affect relationships. Also, a strong sensitivity to noise can really impact one's ability or desire to engage in social activities and events. So this can play a role also in relationships. Now, this by no means is an exhaustive list of difficult areas, but just those things that I see as impacting relationships most critically. So there have to be these commonalities to get this diagnosis. But once there's a full range of personality traits. So while one has to struggle with social interactions and social understanding to get an autism diagnosis, after that, one's personality can be very different. For example, there are people on the spectrum who are mostly nice people and maybe sometimes irritable and mean, but they're very nice, good-hearted people. There are also people on the spectrum who are mostly mean and only sometimes nice. There are people on the spectrum who are more extroverted and are constantly trying to relate to others, while others on the spectrum are very introverted and avoid people at all costs. And I think recognizing this range is very important, and to not attribute all of someone's behaviors to this diagnosis. So another area is just around special interest. So having specific strong interests, which is often referred to as special interest, it is a diagnostic trait of autism. Actual interests vary widely, though I've definitely commonly seen trains, airplanes, other mechanical things like elevators, Marvel comics, video games, and anime as being very common special interests of individuals on the spectrum. I've also seen relationships, psychology, photography, hiking in the outdoors, exercise, sports, engineering, cycling, both doing it and repairing and building bikes, chess, math, and computers, all as specific special interests of people on the spectrum. And also the number of interests varies. Some people I've worked with are really only interested in one or two things, very intensely interested. And others have several interests, maybe 6 or 7 things or more. What I have observed that is common is that the person really lights up about any of these interests, but often is really shut off and disinterested if the topic is anything else. And of course, that can get in the way of forming good relationships. So in the next part of this presentation, I'm going to be reading narratives and telling stories of people's experiences. Now, why am I relying, or am I going to be relying so heavily on story and narrative? Well, in my opinion, and the opinion of many professionals and many people, it is only really through listening to the experience of others that we can really understand. And it is through understanding that we can build better relationships. If you are neurotypical, which is a word coined for people who are not on the spectrum, if you are neurotypical, building a better relationship with someone who is on the spectrum will require much understanding. And if you are on the spectrum, building a better relationship with someone neurotypical will also require much understanding. Well, the stories that I read, where do they come from? Well, first, I wanted to say that this presentation was somewhat inspired by Tony Atwood. And he is a clinical psychologist who worked almost exclusively with people who at the time were diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. And in his work, he uses a great deal of quotations and narratives of people on the spectrum to illustrate concepts. And I found it to be very helpful and the best work. I feel that it's some of the best work that's been done about ASD. Now, in addition, something that's been very helpful to me as I began to increasingly see more and more people on the spectrum is important to deepen my understanding. And I've been reading autobiographies of individuals on the spectrum. Now, the rest of these books here are either autobiographies or they were written by people on the spectrum. Now, I also, of course, will pull from my own experiences. Well, the first area to explore is social understanding and communication. And the first quote is from the book There's a Boy in Here. Now, this is a very unique book. It was written by Judy Barron, a mom who describes her difficulties and confusion in raising her autistic son. Her son, Sean, also contributes to the book. Now, he engaged in many repetitive behaviors and was minimally interactive with his parents or with other people until he was a teenager. He developed better communication skills over time and eventually became a journalist. At the end of each section of the book, which is written by his mother, he remembers that period of his life and he explains his behavior at the time. In this chapter that I'm referencing, his mother had been writing about how at age 11, Sean very persistently and repetitively would question any visitor who came to the house about the states. She could not understand his behavior, and she could not get him to stop. She felt he was really pestering these people who were coming over. Now, here's what he says about this. I had a driving need to ask questions about the states in the USA, because I felt I could not talk the way normal people talked, nor could I take part in their conversations since I didn't understand them. Everyone else talked effortlessly, their conversations flowing as smoothly as a creek, and I felt very inferior, shut out, less important. I had to compensate for what was lacking. And what better way than to show people that I knew all 50 states, their positions on the map, the shapes of each one. I needed to show everybody how smart I really was. And by asking the questions, I was doing just that. I never asked, what states have you been to? But rather, have you been to Montana? So I could show them I knew all the states. Now, in my experience in living skills, I have worked with many people on the spectrum who would ask repetitive questions or engage in a repeated identical interaction where they repeatedly gave the same information. I felt baffled by their behavior. This passage really helped me wonder if something similar might have been going on for them. It really opened my mind and made me curious. Something that I want you all to remember, which is the most critical advice that I can give you, is in your relationships, don't be reactive, but be curious. Then you can learn to understand your family member, partner, friend, coworker, etc. Now, this next quote is from the book Look Me in the Eye by John Elder Robison. He is discussing how he was misunderstood and blamed for having poor social skills and a lack of empathy. And many young people I have worked with get criticized for this. Now, here we go. By the time I was 12, I had progressed from if he doesn't get better, he may have to be institutionalized, to he's a weird, screwed up kid. But although my communication abilities had developed by leaps and bounds, people had ever higher expectations for me. And I began having trouble with what the therapists called inappropriate expressions. One time, my mother had invited her friend Betsy over. I wandered in as they sat on the sofa, talking and smoking. Betsy said, "Did you hear about Eleanor's son? Last Saturday, he got hit by a train and killed. He was playing on the tracks." I smiled at her words. She turned to me with a shocked expression on her face. "What? Do you think that's funny?" I felt embarrassed and a little humiliated. "No, I guess not, I said as I slunk away. I didn't know what to say. I knew they thought it was bad for me to be smiling, but I didn't know why I was grinning, and I couldn't help it. I didn't feel joy or happiness. At the time, it was hard to figure out exactly what I did feel, and I felt powerless to react any differently. My mother sent me to therapists. They didn't make me any better. None of them figured out why I grinned when I heard things. But now I know. Here is what went through my mind that day. Someone got killed. Damn. I'm glad I didn't get killed. I'm glad my brother or my parents didn't get killed. I'm glad all my friends are okay. He must have been a pretty dumb kid playing on the train tracks. I would never get run over by a train like that. I'm glad I'm okay. And at the end, I smiled with relief. Whatever killed that kid was not going to get me. Today, my feelings would be exactly the same in that situation. The only difference is now I have better control of my facial expressions. Well, the first time I heard that story, I felt stunned. Here, just to imagine if his mother or the friend were more curious, they might have helped this boy discover his thought process much sooner. And they might have liked him and learned something instead of misunderstanding and judging him. I have worked with many people who smile at unusual and seemingly inappropriate times. I remember one individual who would be walking in public and he would suddenly smile to himself and step and hop. At first, I just thought it was some kind of a tick or an issue, just something kind of strange. And, this person was not very communicative. And mostly he just kind of wanted you to leave him alone. But he would talk to you briefly, if you persisted. So when I was with him and I noticed that he had just smiled to himself, I asked him why. And he told me, oh, I thought of something I liked and was excited about it. It was not a weird thing or a tick of some kind. He was just a bit in his own world and he was excited about something. And this was how much he could contain himself. That was the value of not judging, but just asking. It's very valuable. Now, another thing that can get in the way of forming relationships is a strong focus on what has been called a special interest. Now, this passage that I'm going to read is from a book written by Luke Jackson. He's a 13-year-old when he wrote the book with ASD. I'm sure he got some help, but you can hear that it is very much in his voice. And he titled the book Freaks, Geeks, and Asperger's Syndrome. And here is the quote. After talking to my mom and brothers and sisters about this, it seems that the difference between someone with AS who has a fascination and someone with AS, someone without AS, is the level of intensity of their fascination. I can only speak for myself when I say that if one subject is on my mind or I am fascinated by something, then literally everything else is insignificant. I suppose this can be seen as selfishness. And I do try to think of others. Sometimes it is very hard. If I am focused on my fascination, whether it is dinosaurs when I was little, Pokemon, a particular PlayStation game, computers, or anything else, I feel an overwhelming excitement that I cannot describe. I just have to talk about it. And the irritation of being stopped can easily develop into a raging fury. Now that I have written that down, I can see how silly it looks and sounds, but that is just the way it is. Sometimes, well, most of the time, my mind is so full of computers that I don't stop to think about myself or other people at all. When I read this book, I specifically highlighted another point when he says that while sometimes he's aware that the other person is no longer interested in what he's talking about, sometimes he just doesn't care because he's so excited about the topic. And, this can create a lot of hurt feelings sometimes in relationships. And I have an interesting story in this regard. I had a client who noted that his grandfather, who was an engineer, never really would engage or speak with him when he was a child. Okay, so this client of mine, his grandfather, never would talk to him when he was a kid, never really showed any interest in him. And in fact, during visits with his grandparents, his grandfather always seemed a bit cold and distant. He said little and engaged in only the briefest conversation. And this conversation was with his own adult son, my client's father. So my client observed this when he was young for years, watching how his grandfather was. But once, when his grandparents were visiting, another couple who was friends with my client's father came over for dinner. Now, this couple that came over for dinner, the husband happened to be an engineer. And my client saw something that was stunning to him. What he observed was that his grandfather was totally engaged in conversation, appeared happy and almost warm, and talked for almost 2 hours with this complete to him stranger. So my client was totally flabbergasted by his grandfather's behavior and could not make sense of it. Here, this guy ignores his own grandchild for years, rarely talks to his own son, and then has this really warm and really long and intense conversation and discussion with a total stranger to him in front of his family that he's been sort of ignoring all this time. But when my client learned about ASD and came to believe that his grandfather was on the spectrum, much of his grandfather's behavior suddenly became explainable. And he was much more forgiving and accepting of how his grandfather had acted. And in fact, I have worked with more than a few people on the spectrum who came to understand and forgive a parent for seeming neglect and insensitive behavior because they realized that this parent was like them, probably on the spectrum. And once again, trying to understand a behavior instead of being offended by it would have saved my client some heartache and might have helped him form a relationship with his grandfather, namely by showing interest in his grandfather's special interests. And that's a great way to build a bridge with someone who is on the spectrum. Okay, well, next I want to talk briefly about this area of abstract thinking. And, I want to talk about two things. One is this black and white thinking, which, commonly is sort of a common way of thinking, a common thought process with people on the spectrum. And in black and white thinking, seeing nuance and seeing shades of gray is difficult. And the other thing that's difficult here is theory of mind. And theory of mind, I mentioned it before, but I'm just going to reiterate. Theory of mind is the ability to recognize that others are thinking and feeling different things than we are. And this is often not well developed in people on the spectrum. And as a result of this, recognizing the impact of one's actions on others and determining what others are likely to be thinking or feeling can be very difficult. Now, this next quote is from a very excellent book. And I would recommend all of these books that I'm quoting to anyone in this audience that's interested in learning more about individuals on the spectrum. But this book especially is excellent. And it's called The Unwritten Rules of Social Relationships. And it was written by Temple Grandin and Sean Barron, who we discussed previously. And then there's a third author who kind of narrates and ties things together. But the book is full of stories, ideas, and suggestions with many, many direct quotes from Temple Grandin and Sean Barron. And this quote is from Sean Barron. And I think it highlights these difficulties with theory of mind. Autism has a way of affecting one's ability to character judge, thereby making it harder than solving a Rubik's Cube with both eyes closed to judge others' motives. Unless someone's facial expressions were blatant, or unless the person forcefully expressed, say, anger, I had great difficulty deciphering people's feelings. Even in my early teenage years, I didn't know that people can and almost always do feel more than one emotion at a time. I couldn't reconcile how someone could experience conflicting feelings, such as happiness and sadness, at the same time. It just didn't make sense to me. You were angry or not angry, sad or happy, confused or with it at any given time, but not both. So naturally, right, these difficulties that he is talking about make having successful relationships very difficult. And I have in my work as a therapist worked with many couples where one member of the couple is on the spectrum. And often in these situations, it's a late diagnosis. So these couples are older, and one of the individuals in the couple realizes that they might be on the spectrum. And then maybe they get diagnosed or they come to me and I start to work with them. So years ago, I knew a woman on the spectrum that was struggling in her relationship. And one of the sources of their struggles was that she continually asked questions of her boyfriend as she was trying to understand his behavior and thinking. Now, because of his own history, he experienced these questions as if he was being interrogated for doing something wrong. Meanwhile, in her mind, her questions were innocent, right? She was just trying to understand him and what was going on. So she could not understand why or how he could possibly be getting upset. And it caused a lot of strife and many fights. Once they both understood the role of ASD in this interaction, they could then avoid the fights and have a much more harmonious relationship. Well, lastly, I want to talk a little bit about sensory issues. And now, it can be hard to see how environmental sensitivities and issues might get in the way of relationships. But they can, and they do. In terms of general social functioning, probably noise sensitivities interfere the most, because especially when people are younger, there's a lot of group activities and things like that. But all these sensitivities with light and smell can also interfere. Now, this next quote is from the book Pretending to be Normal. Now, Pretending to be Normal is the autobiography of Leanne Willey. She is a PhD in education who specializes in psycholinguistics and learning style differences. In describing her childhood, she says, "I also found many noises and bright lights nearly impossible to bear. High frequencies and brassy tin sounds clawed my nerves. Whistles, party noisemakers, flutes, and trumpets, and any close relative of those sounds disarmed my calm and made my world very uninviting. Bright lights, midday sun, reflected lights, strobe lights, flickering lights, fluorescent lights, each seemed to sear my eyes. Together, the sharp sounds and the bright lights were more than enough to overload my senses. My head would feel tight, my stomach would churn, and my pulse would run my heart ragged until I found a safety zone. I found solace underwater." Now, in my experience, it's really important to be curious about how the environmental sensitivities impact the person that you're in a relationship with, whether it's your child, your partner, etc. And I like to use the following example that most people do understand. Because I think it's hard to understand the level of noise sensitivity or sensitivity to other things if you yourself aren't that sensitive to these things. But many of us will understand this. So many of us, if we get pretty hungry, become extremely irritable, and nothing else matters but eating. We get a headache, our stomach hurts, we may even get dizzy or spaced out. Once we know this about ourselves, we don't blame ourselves, at least not too much, for our behavior when we're hungry. We just make sure to eat quickly. We plan out meals, we bring snacks, and we prevent the situation from occurring in the first place as best we can. Now, part of the growth in awareness that people on the spectrum, their parents, their partners, and even friends should develop is an awareness of the impacts of these different sensitivities. I remember once talking to a young woman who had realized that her lack of success in a job was simply from the chaotic and noisy environment. I think it was her first job. She struggled to determine if she should challenge herself by trying to succeed in the job or look for a job in a quieter environment. She ended up realizing that challenging herself made sense, but that the better way to do it was by sometimes going to crowded events where she could leave if she got overwhelmed, not by having to consistently work under these conditions, which just took too much of a toll because she was exhausted. She ended up getting a job where she worked more in the back, was a little bit more isolated. It wasn't as loud. It was less chaotic, and she was more successful and enjoyed work more. Now, I want to take a minute and just go over or recap some strategies and attitudes that will be helpful in general. I believe these are critically important if you want to develop or improve your relationship really with anyone, but especially with a child, family member, or friend who's on the spectrum. The number one thing is simply to be curious about behavior that you don't understand. Ask, investigate, explore. Don't just judge and react. Now, this takes patience, as the other person may not know or be able to explain the reason for their behavior. But your curiosity, if it expresses a real interest, and this is really important, it has to be real curiosity. And if you are not judgmental, it at least makes it possible to discover what's going on. And again, with anything, don't expect results right away. It's something that you have to do over time and do a lot. And if you're on the spectrum and someone's bothered with your behavior or actions, you will increase your success in relationships if you try and understand their reaction. So that's important. Now, in my work at Integrated Community Services, we provide staffing to many individuals on the spectrum. We always recommend to our staff who are first developing the relationship with someone that we're working with to show an interest in that person's passion. Find whatever it is about that topic that is of interest to you. That's the key. Because it can't be fake or feigned interest, but really you find what you're interested in about that topic, and then you use this to build the relationship. And then you can try to move the person towards having more of a back and forth conversation. Again, it's not a simple fix, and don't expect results right away, but someone on the spectrum, their special interest, it's a way in. Now, another problem is a lack of flexibility. That's a problem in relationships. And there's also a connection between this and black and white thinking. And just, if you're a parent, just, I would really urge you not to cater to your child to keep them comfortable at all times. Have some expectations and, force them to compromise about, acceptable things. And this will help a lot in the long run, though you will have to deal with some bad reactions in the short run. I know as a parent, things like this are very hard to navigate. Temple Grandin tells the story that when she was young, her mother understood that she could not manage big family get-togethers. They just weren't her cup of tea. They were put a lot of stress on her. But the compromise was that Temple would greet everyone properly, make eye contact and smile. And she had to do this in the beginning of all these gatherings. And then she could go do her own thing. And she talks about how this allowed her to recognize the importance and develop a habit of showing common courtesy, even when she didn't feel like it. So if you are a parent, now, if you're a parent of someone who's in their early 20s or 30s, who has not had to compromise, and they avoid doing anything they don't want to do, it's important to think of all the things you do to cater to them and figure out where you can pull back, because they have to face more of the demands of life, just simple everyday things. Now, there's another thing that you want to do, and this is to help support someone on the spectrum build the theory of mind. Now, to help develop someone's theory of mind, one thing you can do is speak out loud what you are thinking or feeling, and do this. It's especially helpful if you do this from when your child is young. This will help them to learn that what is in your mind is different than what is in their mind. You keep it simple, especially for younger children. For example, your child may be eating and you say something like, "Now I have to wipe off the table because I want it to be clean for dinner. I feel happy when things are clean. I hate it when I put my hand on the table and there are crumbs there. It feels yucky." Now, if the person is older, this is really more about explaining your thinking and your feeling to them about things, and then asking them what they think and trying to engage in this way. And again, if you're on the spectrum, it's good to work to develop your theory of mind skills. And if someone is bothered by your behavior or actions, you want to understand the reaction instead of dismissing it or feeling offended or feeling angered. Just be curious and try to understand what they're bothered about. And then you'll learn, about them, and you'll learn more about, neurotypical thinking. Now, lastly, another thing to pay attention to is just the impact of the environment, to recognize what is a reasonable challenge and what environment is too much. Do not expect your partner or family member to simply enjoy going out to eat at a noisy restaurant if they're noise sensitive. Ask what environment might work. Try to come to a compromise about it. A compromise usually is something that's a little bit of a stretch for, a person who's very noise sensitive, say, but is not over the top, and just two more things to say here. One is that, discomfort is a part of life, and so are expectations. Remember, don't overly cater the environment. Have expectations in your relationship based on understanding your loved one. You can expect kindness and rule following, but you cannot expect your children or your partner to like exactly what you like, or to want things that they don't want, that you think maybe would be good for them. Last, but certainly not least, enjoy the uniqueness and differences of the person you are with. If they're on the spectrum and you are not, understanding their experience will enhance both of your lives. And likewise, if you are on the spectrum, trying to understand the neurotypical experience of a family member or friend will help you navigate in the world and get more out of life. Okay, so if you're interested in getting in touch with me for therapy, you can contact me through my email or my phone number. I do telehealth sessions. I'm licensed in California and Idaho, and I'm based in Idaho. Now, also, if you're interested in living skills services and you live in Marin County, you can contact me there. I have a different email there. And also, we do provide remote services through people's SDP plans. We are able to provide that to people in all different parts of California. And the types of services we provide are some social clubs and social groups. And also, we can support people in college, like community colleges and other colleges, through remote services. All right. Well, thank you so much. Do I stop sharing?
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, you can stop sharing if you'd like now. Slides will come to you, so you'll get Michael's information. They'll come tomorrow, like I said. And if people notice, I did put in the chat the links to our spring calendar, so you can see some of the other events, but also the link to the Spanish evaluation and the English evaluation. And again, if you could just click on that, 4 questions, fill them out, we really appreciate it. We do have one question so far, and that is, I'll read it for you. Is there any research or data that shows that gluten may have negative impacts for people on the spectrum? My young adult son has been on a gluten-free diet since he was 8, but now he's in college and he started eating a little gluten occasionally, and it seemed to make him more anxious, but it's hard to know for sure. Any experience with that?
Well, I do have experience of just speaking to many parents that have noticed when they take gluten out of their child's diet who's on the spectrum. There are a number of different improvements, and a lot of them are behavioral. So it's definitely something that I've seen, and I have worked with some individuals who have like a gluten ban, because if they eat gluten, it seems like their behavior, it's very hard for them to control their behavior. So I've definitely had that experience. I don't know if there are studies showing that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were.
Okay, and someone else wants to know, are there other social clubs you mentioned with ICS, Integrated Community Services, mixed with neurotypical peers? Question.
Well, they are for anyone who receives services from ICS. So we provide services at ICS to people with all different developmental disabilities. We also provide services to people with other disabilities through Department of Rehabilitation, and we also have a mental health services as well. So there's typically a range of people, and there's a few staff people as well that are there. So that's kind of who is at those groups.
Someone just wants to know that you're awesome. They just want you to know that you are awesome, Michael. And let's see over here in the chat. Are you aware of those on the spectrum having heightened interoception, awareness of their inner body sensations?
I've not heard about that.
Okay. And then someone else is saying that Julie Matthews has done research on gluten and has a book, Nourishing Hope, and a website. So I am going to just copy that and make sure that that gets into the email that I send. And then I'm going to ask again if folks could please fill out those surveys. I'll put them in the chat again. Can you speak more about the support ICS offers for community college students?
Well, it typically we have well, a lot of our services are provided through the regional center. So we're a vendor of the regional center, and we work specifically with Golden Gate Regional Center. But we have something called a TDS program, Tailored Day Services, and that program specifically focuses on education. And usually part of what we're doing is helping people get set up. A lot of it is with the College of Marin, which is in Marin, but we do have people that have been at Santa Rosa Junior College, San Francisco State University, and a school in Southern California. And it's a lot of support around planning, like looking at courses, helping people get set up with the Student Accessibility Services Department or Student Disability Services Department, being aware of resources, helping people with schedule organization. Sometimes there's some help with understanding like kind of assignments and what they're about, but usually we try to filter people to tutors that are, because our people aren't tutors, they're more like, they're more working on the executive functioning and planning side of things, just to make sure that the student is aware of what all the requirements are, and trying to help them set up systems to manage the school setting, basically. I hope that helps.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I just want to make sure I get this question in as I look at the clock on the screen. Somebody's thanking you for all of this. Very relevant and helpful info you've provided here. I would like to share screens and shots of slides with friends and professionals who can use the info to help those they work with or close to. Is that all right with you?
Sure. Well, my understanding is you'll be sending this out, so it's fairly
right. But it's very nice that they ask if it's okay if they share it even further.
Thank you for for asking. And I mean, I would highly. I send a book list out to everyone that I see, for for therapy if they are on the spectrum, or if they are, I'm working with them because they're a parent, or their partner, is on the spectrum. But I would really advise reading the work of Tony Attwood, which is very excellent, and the Unwritten Rules of Social Relationships is just, in my opinion, a really fabulous book. They also have the audiobook version of it. But just these autobiographies are very, very helpful for getting insight. A lot of times, partly it's because many of these people went through a stage where they were not verbal and they couldn't explain what was going on. And then later, they got much more insight into themselves and they could go back and explain and talk about what they'd been through, or just kind of explain like why they did this repetitive thing that nobody around them could understand. And that information to me was really eye-opening.
That is. Do you mind? I know it's 7:29. Can you take a few more, maybe?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. One of our Spanish speakers has asked if tactile stimulation helps to reduce sensory sensitivity and helps people on the spectrum to relax.
I mean, I'm not as familiar with the sort of the kind of I don't know what you call it, sort of physical rehabilitation or physical support side of things, but I know that I've heard that a lot, that does help calm people and reduce sensitivities. And Temple Grandin, in fact, created a machine, the squeeze machine, for herself that she found to be very, very helpful.
Yeah, I remember that from the movie. Let's see. People are okay. So I'm just going to direct people's attention again to the evaluation links and ask. Let's see. There were a couple more questions there. They seem to have disappeared. You can see. Someone saying, I'm the one on the spectrum. This will help support my ability to advocate for myself and others and raise awareness. I think that's a wonderful comment to end on. That just makes my heart sing. So thanks for sharing that. And thank you. Thank you, Michael. I think I've learned things myself. My daughter doesn't have autism. She has Prader-Willi syndrome, but much of what you were talking about is very applicable to her. So I thank you for that. I thank you for coming, spending your time, sharing your wisdom. Michael will actually be back in May, where he'll have more of his ILS hat on and talking about housing for regional center clients. So thank you, Michael, for coming and for coming back. Thank you, Beatrice, as always, for your expert Spanish interpretation. Thank you, everyone, for coming. You're getting lots of love and thank yous here. So once again, we appreciate everybody's time. And Michael, we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Good night.